Welcome everyone. In this video, we will learn about authorization process for APIs in API Maker. Let's say one user is requesting one API, so API Maker instance will receive that call. After that, based on API category, it can select its specific settings. We can define authorization settings at API level or connection level or database level, and if not provided on any of these level, it will pick up from the default secret level. Same as for third party, we can provide those authorization related settings on API level or API version level. For system API and custom API, we can provide on API level. Now once settings are received, based on those settings, API Maker can decide that this API is a public API or it is authorized API. If API is a public API, then it will simply execute with API with pre-hooks, API and after that post hooks, and it will return response to the user. In case of authorized API, X-AM-Authorization header is required. When API Maker receives that header, it will open that token and it will extract API user information from that. Based on API user, API Maker will receive number of the groups assigned to that API user. If we have given permission to hit that API in any of these groups, user can hit that API. Now with that, we can also provide other authorization also. We can provide database level authorization, AWS user, Google user and Azure user. And we can also provide all of them if we want. Now when database user authorization is provided, X-AM-User-Authorization token is required. When this token is provided, API Maker will open that token, and if it is able to open the token, that means it is valid token. And if a group related information is provided, API Maker will find assigned groups to that user, and if any of these group has a permission to hit the API, API Maker will allow to hit that API and it will further check for other authorizations. The same way AWS, Google and Azure authorization works. If all the authorizations are passed, API Maker will execute a pre-hooks. After that, it will execute API and after that post hooks, and it will return response to the user. In pre-hooks, we can write code, and in that code we can get all the information of these authorization related data, so we can know which user is hitting the API, and based on those users we can modify their request payload also, and if required we can throw appropriate errors also. In case of database user and API user, you can use this system API to get the token. AWS, Google and Azure, they will provide you user token because the users are stored inside them. Now let's assume you are using API Maker for only one project, and that is e-commerce platform. By default, all your APIs will be secure and needs token. To make any API public, you can just modify this setting. API access type 2 is public, and when you update the setting, you will see this flag in API testing environment that this API is a public, and you can directly hit that API without any authorization header. Here in this header section also you will not see any authorization related header. That means this API is a public. In case of third-party APIs, we can specify the settings at the level of API version or at the level of API. API level settings has highest priority, and if we specify it at this API level, that means no one else can override that setting. So let's see, we want to make this entire version as a public. For that, we can just modify this is public, and all the APIs of these versions are now public. But let's say we want to make delete file as a token base. So here we can specify that it is having token. So As we saw in our earlier diagram, we can specify settings at API level, which is having highest priority, API version has a less priority, and default level has a least priority. In case of database APIs, we can specify settings at database level or collection level or at specific API level also. So, if we want to make all the APIs of one database as a public, we can specify here, we save that all the APIs of this database are public. We can override those settings for specific collections, and we can more override on API level also. We have one project for this installation of API Maker. We go to Secret, and when we open that, here we can specify authorizations details. By default, it will need X-AM-Authorization of the API user, which is this user. But for other users, let's say for database, either you can click on this I button, or if you open the documentation, in these examples, authorization AM database, you can copy this entire object and paste here and modify the details accordingly. I will copy paste my object here, and it is saying that in this instance, this database, this table or collection, our username is this field and our password is inside this field. And when we generate the token, we want these two additional fields inside the token. Plus, this user should have access to these groups, so our groups are saved in this column. When we update these settings, that means all our APIs has two types of authorization required. One is this API user, plus other one is this database user. So let's go to one custom API, this hello world. If you see these headers, X-AM-Authorization means our API user, and X-AM-User-Authorization means our database users. In this testing environment, API Maker will automatically handle header values of these headers, so no need to pass them here. But when you hit this API from your front-end or mobile application, you need to get the token for these headers and need to pass them. To get the token, you can go to System API. Here you can go to Get Token, go to Body, and here you can pass these values. And when we provide all this information, username and password for API Maker user, and this username and password for this instant database collection table for database users, and when we hit this, we'll get the two tokens. So this system API supports multiple sections to get the token for multiple users. You can pass these tokens from your front-end or mobile application to access those APIs. Now let's say we want to provide Azure authorization also. For that, we can provide like this. So that means this is our app ID and tenant ID, and our auth token type is Azure, and we will pick the email address from this field of the Azure object, and we have associated groups are saved inside this section and inside this field of this instance database collection, and this email will be mapped with value of this field. And when we generate the token, we want to get these fields additionally inside the token. So when we open that token and use it our custom APIs, we can take a decision based on these values. We'll save that, and let's say we go to custom API And here we can see now AM authorization required, user is required, and Azure authorization is also required. When we send that, we'll get those data in return because we are just returning g.request.auth, and inside that we will see all the information of the authorized users. Now here, if we provide actual value of Azure token, and if we send that, we will receive that object of Azure in a response. Here you can see in this field we are receiving the email address, and this is our new object of our database user, which has this email and those two selected custom fields of mobile and favorite food that we saw in secret setting. Let's say we don't provide this header value and still we want to receive this object of Azure authorization. We can do that also. We are not getting anything, but if we go to our secret and here if we provide our test object, we will get that object whatever we pass here. When we don't provide the token, we will get in the response like this. Let's say we just provide only few things. We'll get only those things in response. So that test object is for that purpose. We can use one installation of API Maker for multiple projects also. For that, we can provide authorization detail to their respective databases. For example, in this inventory database, we can provide authorization details on this object. We can save that, and for this, let's say this products database, we can provide authorization details on that different object like this. Now we'll understand how groups are working. Let's go to custom API. Let's go to hello world. Here we can see we need to pass X-AM-Authorization and user-authorization. If we see the settings of this custom API, we don't have auth info here. That means it is getting settings from secret. In secret, if we see in our auth token info, we just need database authorization. So in total we will need two authorization. One is database level and one is API user level. Here we need customers, MySQL inventory customers email, this password. For groups we'll need groups column. So when we hit that, we are getting data in a return. We see the user default. So for that, let's go to this default user, and this user has access to this default group. Let's go to default group, and in a default group we have access to all custom APIs. That's why we are able to hit this custom API for this default group. Now for this database user Rakesh, in database for this user we have groups access as a star, so no need to check for the group. If we can just open that token, that means user can access the API. Now let's create one group here. G1, and in G1 we'll give access to this hello world 2 and public API, and in a database we will give access to G1 only. So here G1, we'll apply that, So here Rakesh has only G1 access. Now let's try to hit the API again, and we are getting error that user Rakesh with username this one is not having access to this API hello world, because G1 group does not have access to this custom API. Now let's give access to this custom API. We'll save that and we'll just try to hit the API, and we are getting that. So we are able to hit this API because this API user default is having access to this API in default group, and this user Rakesh is having access to this API in a G1 group. User should be having access to this API in any of the groups. Then user can access the API, and one user can have multiple groups. The same concept is applied on database API, third-party API, and system APIs also. The same concept is also applied in authorization of WebSocket events.